The city of Halcyon never truly slept, not with its towers glowing like silent sentinels over the river and its streets humming with ambition even after midnight. And yet on that particular evening, there was a strange stillness in the air, as though the city itself had paused to witness something it would later pretend not to remember. Inside a private lounge perched high above the skyline, a woman named Alara Moore stood near the window with a glass she had barely touched, watching reflections of light ripple across the dark water below, unaware that the quiet choice to remain a little longer would fracture her life into a before and an after. She had come to Halcyon for a single reason and a single night, a temporary escape wrapped in professional obligations, and she intended to leave before dawn, carrying nothing back with her except the familiar weight of independence she had built so carefully over the years. Alara was not reckless by nature, nor was she naive. But there was something about that night, the low music, the softened edges of the world, the anonymity of being unseen, that loosened the rules she usually lived by. It was then that Julian Vale noticed her. He did not approach with urgency or performance, as so many men in rooms like this tended to do, but with a measured calm that suggested he had never needed to chase attention, only to recognize it when it appeared. There was an effortless authority in the way he carried himself, subtle and deeply ingrained, the kind that did not demand acknowledgement yet quietly assumed it. And when their eyes met across the room, something unspoken passed between them, not desire alone but recognition, as if two strangers had accidentally stepped into the same narrow space of possibility. They spoke without introductions that mattered. Names were exchanged casually, incomplete, stripped of context, and neither pressed for more, as though both understood that knowing too much would shatter the fragile freedom of the moment. Conversation flowed easily, weaving through topics both intimate and distant: travel, regret, ambition, the strange comfort of being unknown. And as the night deepened, so did the sense that this connection existed outside of time, suspended and temporary by design. When they finally left the lounge together, the city received them without judgment, swallowing their silhouettes into shadowed streets and quiet elevators. And what followed was not described in urgency or excess, but in warmth, closeness, and the shared understanding that this was a night borrowed, not claimed. There were no promises made, no futures imagined aloud, only the soft certainty that some moments were never meant to last, only to exist fully and then dissolve. Morning arrived without ceremony. Gray light slipped through the curtains, unkind in its clarity, and Alara woke with a sudden, sharp awareness of herself, of where she was, of what staying might mean if she allowed the moment to stretch beyond its limits. Julian slept beside her, peaceful, unguarded, stripped of the commanding presence he wore so easily in the world beyond this room, and for a brief second, she considered watching him longer, memorizing details she would later deny herself. Instead, she rose quietly, gathering her things with careful precision, leaving no note, no trace, no explanation that might invite questions neither of them were prepared to answer. By the time Julian stirred, the space beside him was already cold, the door already closed, and the woman whose laughter had filled the night existed only as an impression he could not quite hold on to. Alara was already gone, merging back into a world that felt suddenly heavier than it had the day before. Neither of them knew, in that early morning silence, that the city had not forgotten them at all, that it had merely begun to wait, patient and observant, for the consequences that would ripple outward from one ordinary night neither fate nor power had any intention of letting remain insignificant. Time moved forward with deceptive ease in the days that followed, as if the world had not shifted at all, and yet for Alara Moore there was a subtle imbalance beneath every ordinary moment, a faint echo of something unresolved that followed her long after she had left the city of Halcyon behind. She returned to her quiet apartment by the coast, resumed her familiar routines, answered emails, attended meetings, and told herself repeatedly that the night in the glass tower was exactly what it was meant to be: brief, contained, and finished. But the mind has a way of holding on to what the heart refuses to name. 6 weeks later, certainty abandoned her. The clinic was small, unremarkable, filled with pale walls and the soft hum of fluorescent lights, and the words delivered to her were spoken without drama, without pause. yet they landed with enough force to steal the air from her lungs. Alara sat still as the reality settled, her hands folded tightly in her lap, understanding immediately that nothing ahead would be simple, and that whatever path she chose would be hers alone to walk. She did not consider finding the man from that night. She did not know his full name, his world, or the shape of the life he returned to after she left, and more importantly, she understood something essential about him even without that knowledge, that he existed in a realm where consequences were negotiated, managed, softened, while hers would be carried in full. And so, after one long night of reckoning, Alara made a decision that required more courage than she had ever imagined herself capable of. She chose to disappear. Years passed quietly. Alara raised her son in a small coastal town where the horizon was wide and forgiving, where people knew one another by routine rather than reputation, and where the ocean offered constancy when everything else felt uncertain. She named the boy Theo, and from the moment he arrived, her world narrowed and deepened in ways she could not have anticipated, every fear counterbalanced by a devotion so complete it left no room for regret. Theo grew quickly, his presence filling spaces larger than his size should have allowed, his curiosity endless, his questions sharp and unfiltered, and from an early age, there was something about him that drew attention without effort. Strangers commented on his intense gaze, on the way he carried himself with an assurance that seemed almost learned rather than inherited, and Alara learned to smile politely while redirecting conversations she had no intention of finishing. She spoke of his father only in absence, not as a wound, not as a tragedy, but as a closed door she refused to reopen, believing that some truths, once spoken, could never be taken back. In Halcyon, Julian Vale built an empire. By the time the city learned to pronounce his name with reverence, he had already surpassed the expectations placed upon him, consolidating power quietly, decisively, and with a precision that left little room for rivals to recover. He became the youngest billionaire in the region, his influence stretching across industries, his presence shaping decisions long before he entered the room. And yet beneath the carefully maintained image of control, there was an absence he could never account for. He remembered the night clearly. The cadence of her voice, the way she had laughed as if surprised by her own openness, the warmth of her presence, and the unmistakable sense that something rare had passed between them. But her face, the details that would have allowed him to find her again, remained frustratingly indistinct, dissolving every time he reached for them. Over the years, he searched discreetly, commissioning investigations that led nowhere, sifting through records that offered no answers, and eventually convincing himself that some moments were meant to remain unresolved. Still, the question lingered. What if she had taken more than just the night with her? The first fracture in that belief came unexpectedly. Julian was leaving a charity event one afternoon, his attention divided between advisors and schedules, when a sudden collision brought everything to a halt. Papers scattered across polished stone, murmurs rose in confusion, and a small figure stood frozen at his side, eyes wide but unafraid. "I'm sorry," the boy said quickly, his voice steady in a way that startled more than one onlooker. Julian looked down and felt something shift violently inside him. The child's features were unmistakable. The same sharp eyes, the same set of the jaw, the same quiet intensity that Julian had seen reflected back at him for decades. And for a moment, the noise of the world receded, leaving only the unsettling clarity of recognition. "What's your name?" Julian asked, lowering himself to the boy's level. "Theo," the child replied. "I'm waiting for my mom." Somewhere behind them, footsteps stopped abruptly. Alara turned, saw them together, and felt the carefully constructed distance of 6 years collapse in an instant. Julian rose slowly, his gaze lifting from the child to the woman he had searched for without ever truly seeing, and recognition, long delayed, finally found its mark. The city did not interrupt. It watched, and waited. For a long moment, no one spoke. The world continued around them. Heels echoed against marble floors. A distant laugh carried through the open doors of the venue. Security shifted subtly at the edges of the space. But within the narrow triangle formed by a man, a woman, and a child, time stretched thin and fragile, as though a single careless word might tear it apart completely. Alara's hand tightened instinctively around Theo's shoulder, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. Yet Julian saw it immediately, not as suspicion or hostility, but as protection refined by years of necessity. Julian did not say her name. Not yet. He studied her face with an intensity that bordered on disbelief, searching for alignment between memory and reality, between the woman who had vanished before dawn and the one now standing before him with quiet strength etched into every line of her posture. She looked older, yes, but not diminished. If anything, there was a steadiness about her that made him realize how little he had truly known her then, how fleeting that night had been compared to the life she had clearly lived since. "Alara," he said at last, carefully, as if testing whether the sound itself might shatter what remained unspoken. She inclined her head slightly, neither warm nor cold, simply acknowledging what could no longer be denied. "Julian." Theo glanced between them, curiosity flickering across his face as he sensed the weight beneath the exchange, though the words themselves revealed nothing. "Do you know each other?" he asked, his tone open, unguarded, trusting in a way that made Alara's breath catch. "Yes," Julian answered before she could, his voice calm but measured. "We met once." Alara did not contradict him. They moved, eventually, out of the open space and into a quieter corridor, drawn less by intention than by the mutual understanding that whatever came next did not belong on public display. Julian dismissed his aides with a glance, a subtle authority that cleared the path without explanation, and Theo walked between the adults with an ease that unsettled Alara more than she cared to admit, as though he had already accepted this man's presence without question. Julian asked questions that seemed harmless on the surface. How long they had been in the city, where Theo attended school, whether they needed assistance navigating the crowd. But beneath each inquiry lay a careful observation, a growing certainty he refused to name aloud. Theo answered freely, his words tumbling over one another with youthful enthusiasm, while Alara remained quiet, offering only what was necessary, her mind racing ahead to consequences she could already feel gathering. There were moments, small, unguarded ones, that struck Julian with unexpected force. The way Theo frowned when concentrating, the way his shoulders squared when he spoke, the familiar cadence in his laugh that echoed too closely to Julian's own childhood memories. And with each passing minute, coincidence became an increasingly fragile explanation. Julian had built his life on patterns, on data, on probabilities that could be measured and controlled, and now every instinct he possessed was aligning toward a conclusion he was not yet ready to confront. Alara saw it in his eyes. She had lived with the knowledge for years, had learned to carry it quietly, to reshape her world around it, and she recognized the moment when suspicion sharpened into awareness. Fear followed quickly, cold and insistent, not for herself, but for the child who stood at the center of a truth she had protected at great personal cost. The interruption came swiftly. A commotion rose near the entrance, voices tightening with urgency, and Julian's security team moved with sudden purpose, their attention drawn outward. He glanced toward the disturbance, his expression darkening, then back to Alara, hesitation flickering briefly across his face. "There's an issue," one of the guards said quietly. "Press activity." Julian exhaled slowly, the tension settling visibly into his shoulders. "Take Theo inside," he instructed, his voice firm but gentle. "It's safer." Theo looked up at him, uncertain. "What about my mom?" Julian met Alara's gaze. "She'll be with you." It was not a question. Alara hesitated only a second before nodding, aware that refusal would draw more attention than compliance ever could. As they were guided away, she felt the weight of Julian's gaze linger, heavy with questions he had not yet asked, answers she had not yet given. Behind them, cameras flashed. Ahead of them, a door closed softly. And somewhere in the space between silence and certainty, a truth long buried began to press insistently toward the surface, demanding to be seen. Alara remained cautious, protective, yet slowly, deliberately, she allowed space for change, watching actions replace promises. Theo adapted with surprising ease. He learned Julian not through headlines or wealth, but through presence, through afternoons spent building models, through quiet conversations, through the steady reassurance of someone who showed up and stayed. The bond grew not as a declaration, but as a fact, undeniable in its simplicity. Between Julian and Alara, something quieter took shape. There were no sudden confessions, no dramatic reconciliations, only shared moments layered with understanding. Glances that lingered a second longer than necessary. Silences that felt less heavy with time. They learned one another not as strangers chasing an echo, but as adults shaped by consequence and choice. Years later, the city of Halcyon continued to shine, indifferent as ever, but the story it had once whispered about softened into something less sensational and far more enduring. Alara no longer ran. Julian no longer searched. And Theo grew up knowing that love, when it arrived late, could still arrive fully. The night that once seemed insignificant became what it had always been destined to be. Not a mistake, not a secret, but a beginning whose meaning only revealed itself with patience. And in the end, what remained was not power, not wealth, not even destiny. What remained was the courage to stay. The end.